The first few seconds of your presentation are the most critical because this is when the audience decides whether they are going to pay attention to the rest of your presentation. Now, there is a way to make a jaw dropping start. I call it the Megalodon Effect. I'll explain what it is and how you can use it. This is Show Stopping Speakers with me, Mobeen Tahir. Here, I share with you stories and practical tips for becoming a memorable public speaker. So, what happened to the Megalodon? The Megalodon was a giant shark that once swam in our oceans around 3 million years ago. The Earth's temperature fell. As a result of that, the Megalodon was unable to adapt to the colder environment in which it found itself. Its food supply deteriorated and eventually it became extinct. Its close cousin, however, the great white shark, was able to adapt much better, even though it was much smaller, a third of the size of the Megalodon. But it adapted much better by relocating, something the Megalodon was unable to do. Moral of the story: you can be the most ferocious predator in the world, literally the biggest shark in the ocean. But if you are unable to adapt in the face of cataclysmic changes in the environment, then you become extinct. Cataclysmic changes like the one we are faced today with the advent of artificial intelligence. So, this is an event which happened in Stockholm's Grand Central Hotel, the city's flagship venue with a majestic room, which is a sort of environment which feels suited to a theatrical performance rather than a financial markets conference, which incidentally was the topic of the event where I was attending. And little did the audience know that I was interestingly going to bring some drama in keeping with the style of the venue and the nature of the room and the dramatic setting we were in. A touch of drama that they weren't expecting. Now, my presentation was on the topic of artificial intelligence. And here we were talking about investing, financial markets, artificial intelligence as a theme that investors can gain exposure to. Now, upon climbing the stage, when I went on the stage, there was a holding slide which mentioned the topic of my presentation, something to do with artificial intelligence. And as soon as I took the stage, the first thing I did was I clicked to the next slide, and the first slide of the presentation showed an image of a fierce, gigantic shark with its jaws wide open. And at that point, I launched into this sequence that I just shared with you. Now, later that day, I was tagged in LinkedIn posts by people who were in the audience who cited this story, grasping perfectly the point that I was making about the importance of adapting in the face of these changes in our environment. The story achieved its intended goal. And there are several reasons why it made an impression on the audience, which I will share with you now. Because if you employ those same techniques, you can indeed make a memorable impression when you begin your presentation, regardless of the topic. So, first and foremost, the element of surprise. The element of surprise creates engagement. Now, this was a highly unusual way for any presenter, particularly at an investment conference, to start their presentation. The element of surprise is what got people engaged. What's this giant shark doing on the screen when we've been listening to topics related to financial markets all day long? Most presenters typically start by introducing themselves, stating their name, their job title, and the title of their presentation, and what they are there to tell the audience. These are all details which the moderator normally has already covered. Next up, we have such and such person from such and such organization who is going to talk about this. And when they go onto the stage, those precious moments, the beginning of the presentation, the first few seconds, when they really have the opportunity to make an impression on the audience, they repeat those same details, which in most cases have already been mentioned and the audience has already been made aware of. And that wastes very precious time, and it creates repetition, and it really creates a situation where the presenter then has to make a second impression after having lost that opportunity to make an impression early in the first few seconds. So that's number one. The first thing is the element of surprise. Now, surprise creates engagement. The second thing is vivid imagery. And when you use vivid imagery, it amplifies the message that you are trying to convey. The story that I shared about the Megalodon was indeed paired with a very visually captivating image, perhaps even a slightly scary image, an intimidating image of this giant Megalodon shark, which indeed was more than 3 times the size of a great white shark. And it had its jaws wide open, very ferocious looking thing on the screen. And this was the only thing on the slide. And that's the first thing that the audience saw when my presentation started. Now, this sort of imagery is rare at conferences, let alone financial conferences. But that's precisely why this sort of imagery stands out, because it creates a memorable impression on the audience. It breaks the monotony of the series of presentations that they are being subjected to one after the other with something unusual, something unexpected, and of course, vividly engaging and striking. So, two things we've talked about: the element of surprise and vivid imagery on the screen if you're using slides in your presentation. The third thing is the element of stories. Now, in this case, it wasn't necessarily a personal story, and we will talk about personal stories on this podcast in future episodes. But this was a story nonetheless. It was related to the presentation, but it was in a way an analogy. Took the example from this prehistoric creature that lived in our oceans, and we drew a comparison with something that we are facing today. And there was a story, there was a narrative arc, and we as humans, we forget data, but we remember stories. Business pitches appreciate this very fact. We often launch into a series of data points, charts, detail, bullets, all of that information that can be hard to digest if you're being bombarded with all of that information. But when you introduce elements like drama, suspense, some theatrics, along with a narrative arc, that is something that the audience can remember, because there's a narrative arc that they can actually align their minds with. And of course, if delivered with the right intensity, even a compact story like the one I shared can be very hard to forget. Now, those are the three things which are very important. Of course, you want surprise, you want vivid imagery if you are using slides, and of course, you want stories. But for this approach, if you are to use this approach at the beginning of your presentation, you must always remember to do two more things. And those two things are as follows. First and foremost, you have to keep it short. You can't just go into a presentation where someone has given you 15 minutes on stage, which was the case for me at this event. 15 minutes on stage. Now, if I ended up spending 5 to 7 minutes talking about the Megalodon, then of course I've wasted precious moments that I have with the audience. So I had to keep it very short, and this sequence was under a minute. It was there to create an impression, but it wasn't there to take up time from my main messages, my main presentation. So it has to be short and it has to be punchy. And the second thing is to establish relevance, right? We're talking about megalodons and great white sharks, which creates an impression, but it also leaves the audience a bit confused until you establish the relevance with the topic of your presentation. And that's what I did at the end of the story, that if you don't adapt in the face of cataclysmic changes in the environment, you become extinct, like the megalodon. And cataclysmic changes like the one we are faced with today with artificial intelligence. So immediately you bring your analogy, your story, your example back to main presentation topic, and that's how you establish relevance without wasting too much time. So if you do those two things, keep the interesting story short and punchy, and then very quickly establish relevance to your main message. That is how you can make this approach, the Megalodon effect, work in your favor. So, how you start your presentation can make a huge difference. Be bold. Don't be afraid. Be bold. Be creative. And of course, bring out your Megalodons. Thank you for tuning into Show Stopping Speakers with me, Mobeen Tahir. Subscribe for more stories and practical tips for becoming a memorable public speaker, and share this with someone who might find this useful. I will see you next time.